Hello and welcome. Today we're going to break down something that's incredibly important but not always well understood. What happens when you need to make a claim for a psychological injury here in Scotland? Just picture it for a second. You're in a car crash and physically you walk away okay. But the thought of getting behind the wheel again, it fills you with absolute panic. Or maybe something happens at work. No lasting physical damage, but it triggers this overwhelming anxiety. These are the invisible injuries we're diving into today. And here it is, the single most important thing to take away from all of this. The Scottish legal system takes mental harm just as seriously as it takes physical harm. What you're going through is recognized, and it is absolutely valid. So let's start right there, with these injuries you can't see. We often think of personal injury claims as being all about broken bones or things you can see on an X-ray. But Scottish law is really clear on this. A disabling mental condition that's caused by someone else's negligence is just as significant. Now, while the law is on your side, it isn't a completely open door. There are some very specific legal hurdles and requirements, things that don't really apply to straightforward physical injury claims. Understanding these is the absolute key to a successful claim, and that's exactly what we're going to break down. So this brings us to the first, and maybe the most critical, legal requirement. What exactly does the law consider to be a compensable injury in the first place? Okay, so the legal system needs a clear line in the sand. To stop the floodgates opening for claims based on subjective feelings, the law insists on a formal medical diagnosis. It's really all about separating that understandable, normal human response to a trauma from a diagnosed clinical condition. And this distinction right here is so important. Feeling grief or fear or just being deeply upset after something traumatic happens, that's a normal human reaction. The law doesn't compensate for that. What it does compensate for are diagnosed illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder or clinical depression that develop as a direct result of what happened. So here are some of the most common conditions that we see in these kinds of claims. PTSD is probably the one everyone's heard of, with its really debilitating symptoms like flashbacks and severe anxiety. But the list also includes things like adjustment disorder, or even specific phobias, like developing a crippling fear of driving after a road accident. Okay, now we get to a really crucial legal idea that fundamentally changes what you need to prove. And that's the distinction between being what's called a primary victim and a secondary victim. It's pretty straightforward when you break it down. A primary victim is someone who was directly in the zone of danger. So think of the driver who was actually in the car crash. A secondary victim, on the other hand, is someone who witnessed the event or its immediate aftermath, like a bystander who sees the crash and suffers a psychological injury because of it. For primary victims, the law has this fascinating principle. It's often called the eggshell personality rule. Basically, it says the person at fault has to take their victim as they find them. So if you already had a vulnerability to anxiety and the accident made it 10 times worse, the other party is still responsible for the full extent of the harm. Your unique vulnerability doesn't let them off the hook. For secondary victims, though, the rules get much, much stricter. These 4 criteria, which were actually established after the tragic Hillsborough disaster, were designed to limit claims, and you have to meet all 4 of them. You have to have witnessed a sudden, shocking event involving a loved one with your own senses, right there at the scene or in its immediate aftermath. It is a very, very high bar to clear. Okay, so let's say you meet these legal criteria. How do you actually go about proving your injury in a legal setting? That brings us to the all-important role of evidence. The very first step is the most important one, both for your health and for any potential claim. Go see your doctor. This creates that medical record that really forms the foundation of your case. After that, getting a specialist solicitor on board and obtaining an independent expert report are the next key moves to build a really solid claim. So that expert report, which usually comes from a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, that becomes the absolute cornerstone of your claim. It has to provide a formal diagnosis based on established criteria, it has to clearly link your condition to the accident, and it needs to offer a professional opinion on your chances for recovery. This leads us to the final big question. If a claim is successful, how is it valued? How on earth does the law put a figure on suffering? Well, the main part of it is a payment that has this fancy Latin name, solatium. It sounds complicated, but it simply means compensation for the non-financial side of things.
the pain, the suffering, and the way the injury has affected your ability to enjoy your life. So how is that figure actually decided? Well, it's not just plucked out of thin air. The courts use established guidelines that connect the severity and the duration of your illness to a specific compensation bracket. So a minor condition that gets better in a few months is going to be in a lower bracket, while a severe, permanent condition will obviously attract a much, much higher award. But the claim doesn't stop there. It also has to cover all the financial losses that are connected to the injury, and these are known as special damages. This can include lost income if you haven't been able to work, the cost of private therapy and medication, and even any care you might need. And honestly, in many cases, these financial losses can end up being the largest part of the total compensation. And so we come right back to where we started. This statement really says it all, doesn't it? Your psychological injury is not something you just have to put up with. It is real, it is recognized, and the law provides a pathway to justice. So we'll just end on this thought. If you are struggling after an accident, please don't assume that just because your injuries can't be seen on a scan, they don't matter. The law says they do. The first and most important step is always to seek help. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.